Bob here, Chopper Bob Customs, and as you might be able to hear, we're having some rain here. Fortunately, no severe weather today, so don't have to worry about large hail or tornadoes, but it is kind of noisy. Hopefully it'll fill up our lake. Anyway, starting a different part of this 57 Chevy project, I'm going to start working on getting the engine and transmission swapped out. The car has, I believe it's a 350 in it now, with a Muncie 4-speed. And we're going to be going with a 383 with a, I think it's a 4L60E. I know it's a 4L and it's an electronically controlled automatic transmission. So there'll be the engine swap, the transmission swap, the shifter swap. There'll be a requirement for the electronics, for the electronic shifting of the transmission. So there's going to be all of that stuff coming in future videos. But today, what I want to do is get the motor mounts located before I pull this engine and transmission out. If you know anything about 55, 56, and 57 Chevys, the engine and transmission mount differently than they do on the later model cars. The engine has two front mounts that are basically rods with rubber biscuits on the top and the bottom that attach the very front of the engine to the frame. And then at the bell housing, there are two side mounts that are rubber bushed that hold the bell housing to the frame. And then the transmission basically just hangs free at the back. The 4L60, 4L80 for that matter, all modern transmissions lack the support structure for that bell housing mount. So what you really need to do is you need to put a transmission mount in the normal location, which is at the tail housing of the transmission. And then what you're faced with is this long, rather spindly at the front support between, you've got it supported at both ends and no support in the middle, and it's not really designed for that. And so the best way to handle this is to put side mounts on the motor engine. And so to that end, the customer has elected to go with the Trans-Dapt kit that has the side mounts that bolts to the frame, and then it has the motor mounts, then it has the motor mounts in what would be considered the conventional location for a small block or a big block Chevrolet. So going to be putting those in. One of the reasons why I wanted to do it, get it situated with the old engine and transmission, is that the old engine and transmission we're servicing okay. So we kind of want the replacement engine to be approximately in the same location that the old engine is in right now. So and so by using the mounts to locate the frame mounts, I'll know that when I go to drop in the replacement engine, it's going to go into approximately the same location that this engine's in. Okay? Now, there are some things that you need to take into consideration when you're doing this. And one of the first is to check and make sure that the engine center line and engine and transmission center line, hopefully those are concentric, or actually collinear, actually. They need to be collinear. The center line of those two are parallel to the center line of the car. And I'll get to the reason for that in a minute, but you want to make sure that the engine and transmission are basically pointed the same direction as the chassis. They don't necessarily have to be centered in the chassis. And what I found when I checked this car is that the engine, surprising to me actually, is that the engine is 9/32 of an inch to the driver's side of the car. As an example, on my 41, I think I have it's either a half inch or a full inch over to the passenger side of the car to make room for the steering. So it kind of took me by surprise that actually this engine is a little bit over to the driver's side, but it is what it is. But the reason that you want it parallel is you want to keep the angles of your drive shaft phased, okay? And by that, what do I mean? Well, if we look at, and here I did a little quick sketch. If we look at the center line of the engine and the transmission and the center line of the pinion, we want the center line of the pinion and the center line of the engine to be parallel. This is looking down from above at the lines, imaginary lines that are there. And in order to do that, if the drive shaft comes out of the transmission and say like it goes over to the driver's side at, let's just say 3 degrees, what we want is we want that angle right there to be 3 degrees as well. So it will be going over from the rear end, it'll be going over to the passenger side of the car 3 degrees, coming out of the engine, going over to the driver's side 3 degrees. And what that means is that this U-joint and this U-joint will be running in the same angular displacement as if they were in a straight line, okay? You do not want to have there to be a difference between this U-joint angle and this U-joint angle, other than one could be called positive and the other would be opposite negative, okay? So that's one of the reasons why I want to make sure that the engine is in the same location. Now there's another plane that you have to think about. This is in the horizontal plane because you're looking down. The other is the vertical plane. And that is a little bit more complicated because, to start with, a lot of times the engine and transmission are set at a down angle at the back. If you look at some intake manifolds, you'll notice that the carburetor is raised up at the back, and that's so it compensates for the engine basically being down at the back so that the carburetor is sitting level. So you have to take that into account when you're looking at the angles. You can't just put an angle finder on it and say, well, that's the drive shaft angle, because it may not be the drive shaft angle. So what you have to do is you have to look at the absolute drive shaft angle, which is, well, actually you don't if you're careful about how you measure the rear end. But at any rate, you need to know how far off the angle is on the drive shaft up or down as it exits the transmission, and you want it to be the same on the pinion. So if the engine is pointing down like this, you want the pinion pointing up like this so that the angles are the same. And here again, that is going to be different than the angle off of the ground because of the engine location or the rake of the car. If you jack the back end of it up, that'll throw this angle off compared to parallel to the ground. And so if you're using just an absolute angle finder, you have to take that into account. The other thing that you have to take into account is the axle wrap. What that boils down to is the tires are rotating this way to drive the car forward. They're having to overcome forces. They're having to overcome the resistance to rolling through, the friction of the tires with the pavement, the friction in the bearings, and then wind resistance. You're trying to shove this brick through the air, and the wind is saying, no, I don't want you to come through me. So what's happening is that it is taking horsepower and torque to turn those tires, even when you're just cruising down the road at a normal speed, at a fixed speed. There is some torque being applied to those tires to drive the car forward. And what happens is the tire, because of the resistance, they're saying, hey, we don't want to do this. And so there's an equal and opposite torque on the rear axle, which tends to drive the pinion up. If you guys that put traction control devices on your car for the launch, you know that on the launch, that's putting hopefully the maximum torque to the ground, which means it really will drive the pinion up on the rear end. But even when you're just driving down the road, it's going to be up a little bit. How much depends on how rigid the rear end is mounted in the car. Obviously, if it's welded to the frame and the engine's on solid mounts, that's not going to have any effect on this U-joint angle. But most of us want suspension on our cars, and even then you're going to have, depending on how good that suspension is, you're going to have some pinion rise on that rear axle. And so what you want to do is you want to put the pinion down so that it matches this angle, plus you want it down another 1 to 4 degrees depending on your rear suspension, what type you've got back there. If you've got a 4-link, you're probably going to want to be closer to the 1 degree, because the 4-link is pretty solid, but here again, there are clearances so that the parts can move, and when you stack all those clearances up, what can happen is that pinion will try to drive up. So you want to start at least 1 degree down with the 4-link. Leaf springs with no traction control, like this car supposedly is going to have, is a different story, because that leaf spring will actually sort of form an S-curve as it tries to rise up. And in that case, you want to be closer to the 4 degrees up. Now, all of that can be taken care of with shims. They make angled shims, so you can tune this so that you get good U-joint wear and you don't get a bunch of vibration. If you put it all together and it vibrates the snot out of you and you know you've got the drive shaft balance, then chances are probably pretty good that your pinion or your U-joint angles are off and you need to check them. And if you've already checked them and you think you have them right, you may want to adjust the shim pack that you've got in the rear end this way. Now, in the case of this, if the rear end pinion center line is not parallel to the center line of the car, then you've probably got some damage somewhere. Either the frame is racked, or the suspension has worn or damaged components, and you need to fix that. Otherwise, the car is going to crab walk down the road. That somebody's following behind you and they can see the doors of your car as you're driving down the road. That indicates that there's something worn or damaged either in the rear end or in the chassis of the car. So that's the reason why I wanted to find where the engine is right now, because we know that, one, the engine and transmission location was working good, and two, there were no complaints about the drive shaft giving him any problems with U-joint angles. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to crawl underneath the car and I'm going to clean out the bolts, the mounting holes for the side motor mounts using a thread chaser. Okay, and the reason I'm using a thread chaser is because on this engine, even though I'm not going to be putting this engine back in, I am going to be bolting the motor mounts up to it. And I just want to be able to get underneath here and bolt them on without any concern that I'm not going to be able to do it. Or that I have difficulty doing it because these 3 holes, 1, 2, 3, and I've got the same thing on the other side. They've been open to the road grime and all sorts of, I pulled some paint out of them. And now I know I'll be able to put 3 bolts in there. So, and 3 on this side as well. So, okay, so this hole, this oblong hole in the frame, is where one of the holes is on the side motor mounts. I've got this bolt in there, and the way I got the bolt in there was to take
a piece of 035. Let's see if I can get this in frame here. 035 weld wire, wrapped it around the threads of a 5/16 bolt, so it was a good tight fit on the 3/8. And you'll have to excuse the dirt. I've already tried it in this frame rail once. This frame rail is just packed full of dirt and oil and roots. I don't know whether it was parked in a field somewhere and stuff started growing into it or what, but it is just flat nasty. But what you do is you just feed it up through where you're going to go through and work your way in, and it will pull the bolt right up into place just like that. And then you undo it. I'll have to turn the camera off to get it off there because it takes both hands. And there it is with the nut put on it. I can get access to it through this whole, I mean, it's got roots growing in it. Anyway, I think I can get hold of the head with a swivel and a socket and then tighten the nut up. I've still got a considerable gap right here, and it's quite possible that what I may have to do is put an engine hoist on the engine and take those front motor mounts out to get this engine down just a little bit. Time will tell. Let's take a look. Let me tighten them up. It's going to take both hands, so I'm going to turn the camera off and show you the finished product, or show you me jacking the engine up and pulling those front mounts out.
Okay, so in an attempt to get the bolt holes to line up on the side mounts, I've gone ahead and taken the weight off of the front mounts, and I have removed them. Just the stands that sit there on the pedestals. If this works, I'll of course take the front mounts completely out. But as you can see, I've got the ratchet straps in an attempt to get the engine centered in the chassis, and I'm going to see if I can get these bolts in by letting this down a little bit. Okay, well, let's set it down on the water pump. So let's take the water pump out. Okay, with the fuel pump removed, it's set right down in there, and the bolts, let's see, I don't know if you can see them or not, right here, and right here, went right in. It sits down a good bit lower than stock, but it is all lined up, and
Now all I got to do is just take some measurements to make sure that it's still centered in the chassis, front and rear, and then move on to the cross member for the transmission. So I'm going to pause this, make sure everything's snugged up. Of course, the other thing I'll have to do is I'll have to drill the 6 holes for the 6 remaining bolts, 3 on each side, and get those bolted in, and then the front mounts will be done. And then, like I said, the transmission mount. So let me pause this and take some measurements and make sure I'm still in good shape.
With that, Chopper Bob out.